everyone, it's Amanda.
This is Megan.
And you're listening to She Did What? It's a podcast showcasing women who've been overlooked in history that we think are really rad and want to tell you a little bit more about so you can...
Or anything about.
Know about them. Yeah.
Some of our stories include like inventions that their credit was taken.
Which happens a lot to ladies.
Men. Yeah.
Yep.
Sometimes it's like a whole institution though too.
Yeah. True. You can listen back to our previous episodes on SoundCloud, where you may be listening to this right now. Check us out. So today we're actually going to do the first part of a two-part episode on the great Black feminist, radical, lawyer, kick-ass woman, Florynce Kennedy. She went by Flo.
Flo.
It's her nickname. And in addition to being one of the mothers, actually, of the modern radical feminist movement in like the 60s and 70s, she was also a big proponent and supporter of the Black Power movement and really was sort of a founding mother of the idea of intersectionality. Mm-hmm. She often compared the struggle of Black people and other minorities with women in the way that systematic societal oppression like forced them down and held them down. So we're going to get to that, but we're going to start in the beginning where she grew up.
All right. So Florynce was born in Kansas City, Missouri in 1916 to Wiley and Zella Kennedy. She and her family grew up in a middle-class, all-white neighborhood.
Her father did well enough to allow her mother to stay home and raise the girls there, which was something that Black women in the South at that time often weren't able to do. They typically had to take domestic work. And so Florynce and her sisters really benefited from having their mother around, and she was very close to her mom.
Yeah, her mother, from a very young age, she totally laid the groundwork for like sexual expression and freedom. But it's funny because Florynce talks a lot about how there were times when she'd be like fooling around with a guy like kind of right in front of her mom. And she even criticizes like maybe it was a little too much for children.
Yeah, Zella was really with all their daughters. They ended up having 5 kids eventually, 5 girls. But they raised them all with a don't take any shit kind of attitude from people. And they had to be tough because they were a Black family living in the South and living in a very racist area. So as Megan mentioned, she grew up in an all-white middle-class neighborhood. And even though they owned their nice home with their property around it, the KKK was really strong in this community that they grew up in. And actually one of the first times that Florynce came into contact with, racist...
The whites.
Yeah, the whites. Was when she was a little girl, about 7, these young KKK guys would come around their house and call them nasty names and threaten their family and tell them to get out of the neighborhood. She actually recalled one time that her mother very, very kindly and patiently talked down somebody who was making threats to them. But these young white guys took to coming to this shed that was next to their house and fornicating with girls in it and then just like shouting insults at her family. So one day her dad, again, this is where the take no shit thing comes from. Her dad walks up to one of these guys and is like, I need you to get off my property and you need to leave. Like, this is my family's home. I've got little girls nearby. And so the guy starts yelling racial slurs at him, and her father, with a beam in his hand, starts beating this guy over the head with like a piece of wood. Yeah. And holding on to him and beating him until a bunch of other dudes come and run up and pull him away. And they never came back. Like, they were left alone forever after that. He was like, this is my fucking property. Get out of here. We don't want any of your KKK bullshit. So from a young age, Florynce had to deal with racism, adversity. So from a young age, like I said, she knew that she had to be tough and look out for herself. She also really wanted to get away from her hometown. At a point when she was still pretty young, her mother decided to go to California for a couple of years and took the three girls. They only had 3 at the time. And they lived in California for 2 years. And Florynce recalls really loving and enjoying that freedom. And actually her mother, even though she was still married, was
right.
enjoying living the life of a single woman.
Yeah, I think that's where she learned her independence. Was I was reading about that time when she talks about her mom deciding to be single for a while, and her just I think that's really awesome. I think she's very lucky to have grown up the way she grew up.
Yeah. So after a couple years in California, Zella did end up going back to Kansas City, Missouri, with Wiley, and they had 2 more daughters. And then Florynce graduated from high school down there.
Yeah, and there's actually this weird 10-year period where there's not much record of her life other than just all like the oddball jobs that she had. But I think it's really impressive that she owned a hat shop with her sisters for a little while at like, what, 18, 19?
Yeah, very cool.
That's really cool.
She's a very industrious and driven young woman. And she didn't want to work in a traditional domestic job, which is what a lot of African-American women did at that time, like work in somebody's house or whatever. But she always knew she wanted to go to college. She waited a little while to do so. But when she moved up to New York City, where her sister Grace, her older sister, had gotten married and was living there. And this was right around the time of World War II. So Grace's husband was a soldier. She and Flo got an apartment together, and Flo decided to get a job in government, which there were a lot more jobs available to women while all of the men were overseas fighting. So she took advantage of that and got herself a job at the VA, working in the payment distribution sector, which again is something that she really wouldn't have been able to do. It would have been very hard for her to get that job had it not been wartime.
I do want to note, right before she left for New York, she participated in one of her first sit-ins at a cafe that was segregated. This came during a time where her and her sister were actually like taking the train and kind of fighting segregation on transportation. During this sit-in, it was just her and her sister, and the crowd became violent in that they forcefully removed her.
They pulled her, dragged her from the counter.
And it says that they dislocated her spine, which led to all of the health problems that we will kind of discuss later. Yeah,
because she wasn't able to really afford proper medical care at that time. She was basically just in bed for like weeks and weeks, and her back never really healed properly, and she forever had kind of a limp, like a very distinctive walk, and she wasn't able to turn her head very quickly or very far to one side. So it messed up her neck. And she lived with that for her whole life, all that pain.
Yeah. So during this time where she just came to New York, she's with her sister. She did sue the cafe. And she talks about how that was her first little, like, how do I say, like
her first encounter with
just using the law to fight social causes.
Right. Also at this time, she and her sister Grace moved into an apartment in Harlem, and it was very common for landlords to deny Black people housing or to provide them with substandard living conditions but make them pay the full rent anyway.
Especially to like young women of color.
Exactly. Hoping that they wouldn't complain or knowing that they wouldn't complain because it was so difficult to find housing if you were Black anyway. But what she did was sign an agreement with this guy and then immediately turn around and sue him for all of the violations in the house. And she won. He had to fix up the apartment because they already had a lease signed and they didn't have any change in rent. Yes. So she was just so clever.
Yeah.
And this is the second example of where she realized that law could be used to her advantage and to fight inequalities and these kind of things. And so that's why.
Well, and I think too that because she grew up in a white neighborhood, she probably like wasn't afraid of it. Does that make sense? Like a lot of Black people are afraid of the system because it just is not just.
Yeah, because her parents raised her to be extremely confident in herself and to not take any shit from anyone. That lesson carried her through her whole life. She wasn't afraid to speak up, and she was an incredibly outspoken person, extremely confident and brilliant.
And actually understanding kind of that like being outlandish would get her more attention for her cause.
Exactly.
Which is great.
Exactly.
What is the well-behaved women, what is it?
Seldom make history?
Yeah.
Yeah. And she wasn't well behaved.
Right.
In the best way possible. So realizing what good law could do for her, she decided that she wanted to be a lawyer.
Yeah. So she applied to Columbia University for pre-law.
At the age of 29.
Yes. And it was, so I'm realizing, okay, because Amanda in her research was talking about how it was the sister school, right?
Yeah. So Columbia actually didn't accept women at that time, or it wasn't co-ed. Women were instead accepted into Barnard College, which is
funny though, because in reports or like in my research, it was called Columbia like General Studies.
Huh.
Like they're not outwardly saying that it's a different college.
Right. Yeah,
That's
actually,
interesting.
I found it was Columbia apparently wasn't co-ed until 1983, which is crazy. So she was. This was at a time when Columbia was almost exclusively white men, like privileged white men. But she might have had a little bit more of an advantage because, again, a lot of the men were overseas for World War II. She was discouraged by all of her friends. People said, "You've got no shot of getting in." They told her to go to a different public university, but she didn't care and applied anyway. And of course, she got in.
Yeah, I will say that it's hard to say she got lucky because she definitely earned it, you know, like in any normal, non-biased, non-discriminate world, she would get it. But colleges were looking to take everybody because they were losing their funding because everyone was off at war.
Exactly. So also right around this time, her mother died, which left her family in kind of a difficult position because the two youngest daughters were still in school. They were considerably younger than Flo and her other two sisters, older sisters. So her father and the two younger girls moved up to New York City, that area, and she helped take care of the two younger girls and also her father, who was older and also kind of sick. And she had decided early on that she didn't want to be a domestic. She didn't want to be a wife. She didn't want to be a mother. She felt like that would have trapped her. And I think that having to take care of her sisters further solidified that in her mind. She was a fiercely independent person and she didn't want to have anything to do with that. She was so committed to becoming a lawyer. That's what she threw all of her energy behind.
Absolutely. And she was also working crazy hours. You mentioned she was in the government job and that's how she was paying for law school. So she was working this crazy job and then also dealing with being...
And pre-law at this point.
Pre-law, yeah. So also being one of the only Black women in the entire university.
She also was, as we mentioned earlier, somebody who was really open to exploring her sexuality. And because they were at a greater risk of being raped by white men and never having those men prosecuted, they had to be more reserved with their sexuality.
Yeah.
Because if they did openly display like, hey, I am a woman who dates and, you know, I'm not trying to settle down and get married, that put them at a greater risk of being assaulted or of not being believed if they were assaulted. But she was bold and she didn't care about the traditional societal standards. She did what she wanted. And she, you know, dated casually and was like a young single Black woman in the city. And she lived her life.
Love it.
So in 1947, she writes a paper called A Comparative Study Accentuating the Similarities of the Societal Positions of Women and Negroes. And this is when we see her beginning to push what was then the really radical idea of intersectionality. So what Flo asserted in this paper, and she had to read it in front of a class, or her class read it, was that white male privilege oppressed all kinds of people in similar ways. It wasn't just that women were oppressed in one way and Black people were oppressed in a different way. It was, she could see that white male privilege oppressed everybody sort of equally. The same mechanisms were at work for all kinds of people. So throughout her career as a lawyer and an activist, she espoused the need for uniting against the white male hegemony and did not see things like feminism or the Black Power movements, which she was a big supporter of, as mutually exclusive. So there were multiple dimensions of oppression. And however, she did agree that racism was more hostile and violent at that time, which it obviously was because women, while being held down, were not being lynched for being feminists at this point.
Well, white women.
White women.
Well, actually, black women weren't. They were just being sexually exploited.
Right. Yes. Right. So it was worse as far as violence went. Racism was more virulent and hostile.
Yes, absolutely.
But there was also a strong need for, the erasure of sexism, which there still is.
Right. So this is kind of her, again, we're seeing building blocks here. And so this is the start of her realizing that it's not just one issue. However, we'll see that, as Amanda just said, that she starts to realize that the white feminist movement is not the same as the black feminist movement. And actually the importance of realizing that.
Yeah. Intersectionality.
Right.
Which is like the most key thing. And this is something that is an ongoing discussion currently in the feminist movement.
All right. So speaking of white male privilege,
when all of the white soldiers came back, they came back to the universities, came back to their jobs, and started complaining because all of these women and black people in this school are taking their spots.
I actually really love the idea of that.
Yeah.
Progress.
Yeah. They were like, but why don't we have all these seats now? So this is why we can't have nice things.
Right. Yes. I was going to say, I feel like there could have been some kind of social movement that the government could have made to kind of help solve that. But the government loves racism.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's why it's systematic, institutionalized oppression.
Because they probably loved that it just like furthered the racism when these soldiers came home.
Well, they just felt they felt entitled to come back and take over their jobs again, which is what happened with all these women who entered the workforce. When these men came back, it was like, okay, well, ladies, go back home and tuck in your babies. The men are here to take over these hardcore jobs again. That happened a lot, but Flo don't give a fuck.
I love it.
And of course she stayed where she was, and she became really even more of a minority because once it was all these white dudes came back, where there had been at least some more women in the university at that time. So she was also fired from her job at the Treasury. She was working at the Treasury at this point because she spoke out against labor rights abuses by the government. So after that, she applied to law school proper.
Yeah. So this is one of the first times that we see a very harsh and blatant, how do I say this, like policy, like racist policy against her.
An explicitly racist policy.
Well, I guess I should say sexist.
Both.
Okay. So, right. And so they denied her at first.
This is 1949 also.
Yes. So they denied her into law school, and she immediately went to the campus and demanded to be let in on grounds of racism. But then someone said to her face, no, it's because you're a woman. So she's like, well, hell no, that's just as bad.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, she went to the people who had denied her and said, it's because I'm black. And they said, no, it's because you're a woman. And she was like, excuse me?
But then she gets into class and realizes she's the only black woman in any of her classes. Like in the whole campus, there's a few women, but in her class, she was the only black woman.
Right. So
Many
we should mention that she was rejected originally.
Mm-hmm.
And after going and talking to this person and saying like, I'm sorry, you're going to exclude me because I'm a woman. You're not going to let me into the school. And basically she vaguely threatened to sue them.
Yes.
And they, after she went home, I think she got a phone call. They were like, good news.
Yeah.
We've changed our mind. Oh no, she got a letter. So she did end up getting into the Columbia Law School. She entered it in 1948. So, and at that time, that freshman class that she was getting into, 10 of them were women and the other 195 were men. So even while still in school, she began to struggle with the extent to which the law could actually provide people with justice. She had really believed in it, and that's why she wanted to be a lawyer. But on several occasions, she said that law school taught someone to walk past a pool of blood and say, what a beautiful shade of red. And what she meant by that is that The kind of objectivity that they were trained to think in required them to be sort of divorced from the reality of the violence that was actually being perpetrated. But because she saw law as a tool anyway, which she had already utilized on several occasions, the diner, her housing, the
Coca-Cola boycott
Coca-Cola,
at that point.
Yes. She got into law school. She kept going with that. Once she graduated, however, she had a really hard time getting a job because being Black and a woman was a double whammy of discrimination. Here's some stats for you. In 1940, only 57 Black female lawyers in the U.S. There were only 57 Black women lawyers in the entire United States. And by 1950, 10 years later, they had made a little bit of progress. Out of 6,271 female lawyers across the country, there were now 83 Black women practicing law. So she was at a disadvantage, and it was even worse in Manhattan, where she was.
She was kind of just a clerk during this whole time with the VA job, that kind of stuff. Very administrative work. Eventually, she was way over it. She just saw all of lack of moving up. In general, just the tasks that women were made to do were not.
It wasn't lawyering work. It was secretarial stuff.
Also, during her career at Columbia Law, she was hosting these salons at her house, which is a very, I'm thinking of a very Gertrude Steiny thing to do, like a think tank.
Sort of. I think what they were more like is parties. She threw these parties, and oftentimes, in the account of her life that we both read over, it said that sometimes she would be the only woman and it would just be a bunch of men because she knew that eventually she was going to have to make connections. She remarked on how easy it seemed for a lot of these Columbia grads to get jobs at big law firms, and it's because they were so well connected. So knowing that, she tried to take advantage while she still could of getting to know these people, and she cultivated what it said is an old white boy network.
Yeah.
And she hosted these parties in her house, which she did for a long time after that. I think she became sort of known for that as well. So right around 1954, she also got really sick. So she had some health problems related to her injury from the diner, but she also started getting really sick. She would get these terrible stomach pains and vomiting and nausea and everything else that goes with that, which is very unpleasant. Eventually, she did end up in the hospital, and it ended up that she had diverticulitis. So say that again? Diverticulitis, which is these little pockets of bacterial infection in the intestines, and she had to have large portions of her intestines surgically removed.
She had 3 feet of her intestines removed.
Yeah, that's a lot.
3 feet.
I mean, you got a lot of intestines, but that's... So her recovery was really slow, and she almost died, actually. But through it all, she joked about it, and humor had always been a staple of her personality. And she, no matter how bad things got, she kept her sunny attitude.
Yeah.
Which is really impressive for a woman at this time. A Black woman at this time.
Right. So following graduating with a law degree, Kennedy ended up opening her own small practice. She talked about how she felt that was the only way she was going to actually have a real job. And so she was her own secretary. She did all of her own work. She typed up all of her own documents. And just kind of took small cases until she brought on this guy, Donald E. Wilkes, a white lawyer from Florida. He worked with a firm that dealt with a lot of entertainment laws. And we'll talk about this in just a couple of minutes, but she ended up finding a passion in that, helping artists that were being taken advantage of by the record labels or law enforcement or the venues or anybody. And her firm was pretty popular. It's safe to say that because of her networking, I'm sure certain kind of civil rights cases were given to her because she was very passionate about it.
Yeah, but she brought this guy on, and then they named the firm Wilkes and Kennedy.
Right, because she was aware that not only bringing a white male would get them more business, but to just go ahead and slap his name first because
she knew that would help broaden her pull.
Right.
'Cause she was so clever.
Yeah. I love how she just like used the system hella hard.
She really did. She was so smart.
Love it.
Also, around this time, though Flo had never wanted to get married, she also still was a woman who needed love and liked affection. And she ended up marrying this sci-fi writer named Charles Dye. She really did love him from what it sounds like initially. He did most of the domestic stuff that she really wasn't interested in. Like, he cooked, he took care of the household and whatever. He was also 9 years younger than her.
I love it.
She never changed her last name. And even though they did live together, she never officially changed her address to his. Mm-hmm. She kept her own apartment as well. And she was the breadwinner. She actually ended up paying for a good portion of his rent. So,
yeah, I think this kind of was a story of she was probably working so hard. He was this drunk, and so he seemed really fun at first. They like live together. He's getting drunk all the time, being home all the time. She's bringing home money.
Yeah, we didn't mention that part. Yeah, so
Yeah.
He was an alcoholic, a severe alcoholic, and he ended up being really verbally abusive. And maybe, we don't know if he was physically abusive, but because Flo was a take no shit kind of woman, when he got crazy and drunk and started becoming aggressive, she just left.
Right.
So they broke up and got back together a couple of times, but he just kind of sucked.
Yeah. He was also a white man. Did we mention that?
Oh, yeah. He was a skinny, younger, little white sci-fi writer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So in 1959, this is kind of a very important pivot in Florence Kennedy's life. She gets hooked up with the Billie Holiday kind of drama, if you will, even though it's forced drama.
Poor Billie Holiday. She had a sad life.
Yeah. So this is after a few charges against her were already made for, drug use or handling drugs. So there was this one case where the police raided the venue she was performing at. They found drugs in her dressing room, took her in. Her legal counsel at the time told her to plead guilty, even though it was there was this whole conversation being had about I need treatment, not jail time. And that's why she pled guilty. But then the judge acknowledged it and then put her in jail anyways. And so what Florence realized from taking on this case was that not only were the record labels aware of artists' drug use, but so were the venues, because they would let them do whatever they want if they played. And so the record labels would just kind of allow them to get all fucked up and then have these meetings about money and take advantage of them. So Florence was one of the people to kind of exploit this. And she also represented Charlie Parker's estate his drug cases for similar exploitation reasonings, I guess. She was also very, very critical. And this is kind of the all-around oppressive institution. She was very critical of the coincidence of persecuting Billie Holiday right after the Strange Fruit track was released, which is officially a recurring theme in our podcast. So she comes out with this very, detailed song about lynchings. It just wasn't hiding anything. And Florence called that out. This is right after the killing of Emmett Till, who was the young black boy that was killed by a mob after a woman
accused him of whistling.
Came out within the past couple months.
Right, that it didn't go down the way it was.
It didn't go down.
No, it didn't.
Period.
Only decades later did she admit that she felt real bad that they killed that black boy for something he didn't do to her.
Oh, God. All right.
Anyway.
Whew, blood boiling. So Florence just kind of went on. She kind of took that as a catalyst to unearth all the tendencies of not only local law enforcement, but really FBI. FBI was investigating Billie Holiday. Keep that in mind, right? A little much.
A little much.
A little much. As I mentioned, this was a pivot in her life. So this was the first time that she admittingly had hung around a majority of Black people, that the majority of people around her were Black. And this really kind of changed everything. She just saw from these cases the extreme amount of, I mean, it's a weight, man. It's a weight put on all of these people. I think from there, she kind of started to veer away from just feminism and starting to call out all of the different, veers off of all these causes: Black power, feminism, Black feminism, which is different from Black power, and white feminism. So I think it's safe to say that was like her stepping point. Also around this time, Wilkes, her partner at the law firm, bailed. He stole over $50,000. He left overnight. And what happened was Florynce and another partner at the time found out that he wasn't being a truthful lawyer. He was exploiting clients for money. He would oftentimes coerce them into making plea deals so that he could make profit. And obviously it bummed her out. But Florynce, being the woman she is, she worked her ass off, and she actually paid back all the clients that she felt had been wronged by her partner. And also at this time, somehow Charles Dye, her former lover, husband, had found his way back into her life. So he ended up kind of acting as her secretary. And because of all the busy work, she talks about how his drinking kind of slowed down a bit, and he wasn't as abusive physically or verbally. But soon, eventually, he just kind of started drinking again. And I think there was this one really like crazy event where she was done. She wanted to leave him, and she ended up paying him $20 a month of alimony just to not have to deal with him. She's like, look, dude, I'll pay you. Just get out of here. Oh, because a part of that was he was like, well, I just worked for you for free, that kind of thing.
Right. Even though she had been taking care of him and like paying half his rent for a long time. So.
Right. So this is when, not too long after they were officially separated, Charlie ended up dying from
cirrhosis.
Yeah. His alcohol
for being
related.
a drunk for so long.
Yeah.
So that brings us into the early 60s. So Florynce has been practicing law for a while now. She's got her own firm. She's had some troubles with that stuff. And she starts to realize that she could only make so much progress within the legal system because of systematic oppression, right? Because the way that the legal system treated people, it was like a one-by-one case. And she felt like she could do more by taking her activism out into the community. So she also started at this time writing for a local Black newspaper called The Queen's Voice. And that's Queens as in the neighborhood, not Queens as in like Regal, where she published a weekly column. She was openly critical of the way Black neighborhoods were treated differently by the police, meaning if they reported crimes, it took forever for the cops to show up. They wouldn't drive through those neighborhoods. They would harass people in those neighborhoods. And so she started moving more towards activism and protest, as she had in her younger days before she went to law school, feeling like she could make a bigger impact outside of the courtroom. She also started joining a number of civil rights organizations at this time. One of them was the National Council of Negro Women. And out of that came another group called Wednesdays in Mississippi. So it was a civil rights organization formed by Northerners, and it was made up of only women. It was the only civil rights organization made up of exclusively women at that time. It was a fully integrated organization, and it was all middle-class, well-educated Northern women. And what they did was, over the summer of 1964, they flew down to rural parts of Mississippi, many times, for the purposes of helping the civil rights efforts there where it was especially bad, and looking into race-related crimes, racist crimes, basically. So she went down there not as a lawyer, but more of as an investigative journalist. She was observing and talking to the people in these communities and then reporting back in her column. She was also documenting murders and atrocities that were being carried out in these really deeply racist communities. So while she did appreciate the cooperation, the interracial cooperation for combating racism that WIMS, W-I-M-S, Wednesdays in Mississippi, that offered, she was most interested in troubling the falsehood of white Northerners' racial tolerance and acceptance. So these well-meaning liberal white women from the North kind of didn't get it, like they wanted to help, but what she saw happening was that these white people were trying to teach the Black people how to defend against racial onslaughts by, if you're going to vote and you're being assaulted, just cover your head to try and block the blows. Or if you get stopped by the police, just try and stay as calm as possible and, defer to their authority. So they were being taught how not to be attacked rather than to stand up and fight back for themselves.
Teaching groups of people how to kind of deflect aggression instead of spending the energy on the aggressors.
Right. You're teaching, they're instructing the oppressed on how to get comfortable in their oppression, get as comfortable as possible in their oppression, rather than trying to push their way out of that.
Right.
Yeah. So she saw that and she wasn't too into that idea. And she was much more fascinated by the stories of the people who were fighting back and arming themselves in these towns that were, all the most fucked up shit that you can think of happening at this time, right when civil rights was just starting to blow up. People being murdered, women being raped or forcibly sterilized, and nobody helping. Like the police not helping. They had no legal recourse. So she was actually taken on one of these trips. She went to this shop, the proprietor of a large dress shop. She noticed that the woman who owned the shop and her home there had a big giant gun leaning next to the door. And she realized that these nonviolent organizations were still arming themselves because they realized that they were going to have to protect themselves at some point. And there we see the roots of this kind of Black militancy that becomes the Black Power movement. And that's when Flo started getting really into that. So that's where we're actually going to leave it, right before 1965, right before the start of her involvement with the Black Power movement, right before she starts becoming like a super radical feminist.
She starts helping change legislation regarding abortion.
Yep, she gets really into that. And we're going to talk about that next week in part 2 of the She Did What episode on Florynce, aka Flo Kennedy. Again, super badass. And if you want to check out what we have been looking at, maybe find it for yourself, the book that we're referencing is called Florynce, Flo Kennedy, The Life of a Black Feminist Radical.
Yes. As well as several other sources that you can find on our description.
Yeah, and also, interestingly, you could go on to archive.com and watch all, like, over 200 episodes of this show she did. What was it called again?
It's called The Flo Kennedy Show.
The Flo Kennedy Show.
Some clips next week. It's really, really fun.
It was through like the 80s, early to mid, late 80s and like early 90s, where she just talks to
I love it.
a bunch of different people. Yeah,
so
she's
good.
Rad. So thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of She Did What?
This episode was written, recorded, and engineered by Amanda and myself. Thank you to Azua always for providing the theme music. And we'll be back next week. Thanks.